The Real Barenziah, Part 9. As Zemeckis had predicted, the theft of the Staff of Chaos had few short-term consequences. The current Emperor, Uriel Septim, sent some rather stiff messages expressing shock and displeasure at the staff's disappearance and urging that Zemeckis make every effort to locate its whereabouts and communicate this to the newly appointed Imperial Battle Mage, Jagar Tharn, in whose hands the matter had been placed. Tharn, Zemeckis snarled in disgust and frustration as he paced about the small chamber where Barenziah, now some months pregnant, was sitting serenely knitting a baby blanket. Jagar Tharn, indeed. I wouldn't give him directions for crossing the street. What have you against this person, husband? I just don't trust that mongrel elf, part wood elf, part dark elf, and part only the gods know what. All the worst qualities of all his combined races. No one knows much about him, claims he was born in Valenwood of a wood elf mother, seems to have been everywhere since. Barenziah, sunk into contentment of pregnancy, had only been humoring Zemeckis thus far, but this piqued her interest. Nightingale? Could he have been this Jagar Tharn disguised? Nay, human blood seems to be the one missing component in Tharn's ancestry. To Zemeckis, Barenziah knew that was a flaw. Zemeckis despised wood elves as lazy thieves and high elves as effete intellectuals, but he admired humans, especially Bretons, for their combinations of pragmatism, intelligence, and energy. Nightingales of Ebonheart and the House of Mora, I'll be bound. That house has had human blood since her time. Ebonheart was jealous that staff was laid here when Tiber Septim took the horn from us. Barenziah sighed a little. Rivalry between Ebonheart and Mournhold reached back almost to the dawn of history. Once the two had been one, all the minds within held the clan Rothim, whose royal house held the high kingship of Morrowind. Ebonheart split into two separate cities, Ebonheart and Mournhold. When Queen Leon's two sons, Morland's grandsons, had been left as the heirs. At the same time, the office of High King had been vacated in favor of temporary war leader to be named by a council in times of provincial emergency. Still, Ebonheart remained jealous of her prerogatives as the eldest city-state of Mournhold, still first among equals, and claimed the guardianship of the horn should rightfully be entrusted to the elder. Mournhold responded that Morland himself had placed the horn in the keeping of the god Ethan, and Mournhold was unarguably the god's birthplace. Why not tell Jagar Tharn of your suspicion, then? Let him recover the thing, as long as it's safe. What does it matter where it lies? Zemeckis stared at her without comprehension. It matters, he said softly, but not that much, he added. Certainly not enough for you to concern yourself further over it. You just tend to your knitting. In a few more months, Barenziah produced a fine son, whom they named Helseth. Nothing more was heard of the staff or Nightingale. If Ebonheart held it, certainly they did not boast of it. The years passed swiftly and happily. Helseth grew tall and strong. He was much like his father, whom he worshipped. When Helseth was 8 years old, Barenziah bore a second child, a daughter, to Zemeckis' great delight. Helseth was his pride, yet little Morgaiah held his heart. Shortly after Morgaia's birth, word came that a plot against the Emperor had been unmasked and that the chief co-conspirators, Jagar Tharn and Rhea Silmain, were dead. Zemeckis rejoiced at this news. I told you so, he crowed. Yet thereafter relations with the Empire slowly deteriorated, for no apparent reason. Taxes were raised and quotas increased with each passing year. Zemeckis felt that the Emperor suspected him of having a hand in the plot and sought to prove his loyalty by making every effort to comply with the increasing demands. He lengthened working hours and raised taxes and even made up some of the differences from both crown funds and their own private holdings. Yet still the demands increased, and commoners and nobles alike grew restless. I want you to take the children and journey yourself to Imperial City, Zemeckis at last said in desperation. You must make the Emperor listen, else all Mournhold will be in revolt come spring. You have a way with men, you always did. He forced a smile. Barenziah forced a smile of her own. Even you. Yes, even me, he said dully. Both children. Barenziah looked over towards the corner windows where Helseth was strumming a lute and singing a duet with his little sister. Helseth was 15, Morgaiah just 8. Perhaps they'll soften his heart. Besides, it's time that Helseth was presented at the Imperial Court. Perhaps, but that's not your true reason. You do not think you can keep them safe here. If that's the case, then you're not safe here either. Come with us, Barenziah urged. He took her hands in his. Barenziah, love, heart of my heart. If I leave now, there'll be nothing for us to return to. I'll be all right. I can take care of myself. I can do it better if I need not fear for you and our children. Barenziah laid her head against his chest. Just remember that we need you. We can do without the rest if we have each other. Empty hands and empty bellies are easier to bear than an empty heart. My foolishness has brought us to this pass. If so, 'tis not that so a place be it. His eyes rested fondly on their carefree children, and none of us shall go without. I cost you everything once, Barenziah, I and Tiber Septim. Without my aid, the Septim dynasty would never have begun. I helped its rise, I can bring about its fall. You may tell Uriel Septim that, and my patience is bounded. Barenziah gasped. Smekus was not given to empty threats. She'd no more imagined that he would ever turn against the Empire than that the old house wolf lying by the hearth would turn on her. How? She demanded, but he shook his head. Better that you know not, he said. Just tell him that. If he proves recalcitrant, do not fear. He's a Septim enough, and he will not kill the messenger. The late winter journey into Imperial City was an easy one. One of the things the Septim Empire had accomplished was the building and maintaining of good highways through Tamriel. Barenziah stood before the Emperor's throne, explaining Mournhold's straits. She waited weeks for an audience with Uriel Septim, bobbed off on pretext or another. His Excellency is indisposed. An urgent matter demands his attention. I am sorry, Your Highness. There must be some mistake. Your appointment is for next week. No, see. And now it was not going well. He did not even seem to be listening to her. He hadn't invited her to sit, nor had he dismissed the children. Halseth stood still as a carved statue, and little Morgaya had begun to fidget. He had first greeted the three of them with a too bright smile and welcome that did not reach his eyes. Then, as she presented her children, he had gazed at them with a fixed attention that was real, yet inappropriate. Barenziah had been dealing with humans for nearly 500 years now, and had developed skill at reading their expressions and movement that was far beyond that any human ever learned. Try as the Emperor might to conceal it, there was a hunger in his eyes, and something more. Regret? Why? He had several fine children of his own. Why covet hers? And why look at her with an intense, though brief, yearning? Ah, well, perhaps he was tired of his lady. Humans were fickle-minded. But after that one long, burning glance, his gaze had shifted away as she began to speak of her mission, and he sat as still as a stone. Puzzled, Barenziah stared into the pale-set face, looking for some trace of the Septim she'd known. She hadn't known Uriel Septim well, having met him only once when he was still a child, and then at his coronation 20 years before. He'd been stern and dignified then, yet not icily remote, as this man was. Despite the physical resemblance, he did not seem to be the same man at all. Not the same, yet something about him was familiar to her, more familiar than it could be some trick or posture or gesture. Suddenly she felt very warm, as if love had been poured over her. Illusion. She had studied well the arts of illusion since Nightingale had fooled her so badly. She had learned to detect it, and she felt it now as certainly as a blind man could feel the sun on his face. Illusion? But why? Her mind worked furiously, even as her mouth went on reciting details about the Mournhold economy. Vanity? Humans were oft as ashamed of the signs of age as elves were proud of them, yet the face of Uriel Septim seemed inconsistent with its age. Barenziah dared use none of her magic arts. Even petty nobles had means of detecting, if not shielding themselves from these in their halls. The use of magic here would bring down his wrath as surely as drawing a knife would. Magic, illusion. Suddenly she thought of Nightingale, and briefly he sat before her, only saddened, trapped. And then that vision faded, and another man sat there, like Nightingale, and yet unalike. Pale skin, red eyes, and elven ears, and about him a fierce glow of concentration, an aura of energy, a shrinking horror. This man was capable of anything. And then, once again, she beheld the face of Uriel Septim. How could she be sure she wasn't imagining things? Perhaps her mind was playing tricks on her. She felt a sudden vast weariness, and as if she had been carrying a heavy burden too long and too far. Do you remember, Excellency, Smekus and I had dinner with your family shortly after your father's coronation. You were no older than little Morgaya here. We were greatly honored to be the only guests that evening, except for your best friend, Justin, of course. Ah, yes, the Emperor said. I believe I do recall that. You and Justin were such friends. I was told he died not long after. A great pity. Indeed. I still do not like to speak of him. His eyes were wary. Ah, as for your request, my lady, we shall take it under advisement and let you know. Barenziah bowed, as did her children. A nod dismissed them, and they backed away from the presence. Barenziah took a deep breath. Justin had been an imaginary friend. Although Uriel had insisted that a place be set for Justin at every meal, Not only that, Justin had been a girl, despite the boy's name. Zemeckis had kept up the family joke long after Justin had gone, wherever such childhood friends go, inquiring seriously after Justin's well-being whenever he and Uriel Septim met, and being responded to as sincerely. The last Barenziah had heard, Justin, after an adventurous youth, had married a high elf and settled in Lilendril. The man occupying the Emperor's chair was not Uriel Septim. Nightingale. A chord of recognition rang through her, and Barenziah knew that she was right. It was he, indeed. Zemeckis had been wrong. So wrong. What now, she wondered? What had become of Uriel Septim? And more to the point, what did it mean for her and Zemeckis and Mournhold? Thinking back, Barenziah guessed their troubles were due to this false emperor, Nightingale, or whoever he really was. He must have taken Uriel Septim's place shortly before the unreasonable demands of Mournhold had begun. That would explain why relations had deteriorated so long, as humans judge time. After her offenses, Nightingale knew of Zemeckis' failed loyalty to, and knowledge of the Septims, and was making preemptive strike. If that were indeed the case, they were all in terrible danger. She and the children were under his hand here in Imperial City. Zemeckis left alone to face the troubles of Nightingale brewing. What must she do? Barenziah urged the children ahead of her, a hand on each shoulder, her woman servant and guards trailing behind. They had reached their waiting carriage, even though their apartment was only a few blocks from the palace. Royal dignity forbade their walking, and for once Barenziah was glad of that. Even the carriage seemed a kind of sanctuary now, false as she knew that feeling to be. A boy dashed up to one of the guards and handed him a letter, then pointed towards the carriage. The guard brought it to her. The boy waited, his eyes wide. The letter was brief and complimentary, and simply asked if King Edwire of Wayrest, High Rock, might be granted an audience with her, as he had heard much of her, and would be pleased to make her acquaintance. Barenziah's first impulse was to refuse. She wanted only to leave this city. Certain she had no inclination for any dalliances with a dazzled human. She looked up, frowning, and one of the guards said, "The boy says his master awaits your reply yonder." She looked in the direction indicated and saw a handsome elderly man on a horseback, surrounded by a half-dozen courtiers and guards. He caught her eye and bowed respectfully, removing his plumed hat. "Very well," Barenziah said to the boy on impulse. "Tell your master he may call on me tonight, after the dinner hour." The man looked polite and grave and rather worried, but not in the least lovesick. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was The Real Barenziah, Part 9. The Real Barenziah, Part 10. Barenziah stood at the open tower window, waiting. She could sense her familiar's nearness, but though the night sky was clear as day to her eyes, she could not yet see him. Then suddenly he was there, a swift-moving dot beneath the wispy night clouds. A few more minutes and the great nighthawk was there, wings folded, talons reaching for a thick leather armband. She carried the bird to its perch, where it waited, panting, while her impatient fingers felt the message secured in a capsule on one leg. It drank, then ruffled its feathers and began to preen. Secure in her presence, a tiny part of her consciousness shared its satisfaction with a job well done, rest earned. Yet beneath that was an unease. Things were not right, even to its bird mind. Her fingers shook as she unfolded the thin sheet and pored over the sheet of cramped writing. Not Zemeckis' bold hand. Barenziah sat, slowly fingers smoothing the document while she prepared her mind and body to accept disaster calmly. The Imperial Guards had deserted Zemeckis and joined the rebels. The loyal troops had suffered a decisive defeat. The rebel leader had been recognized as King of Mournhold by the Emperor. Zemeckis was dead. Barenziah and the children had been declared traitors of the Empire, and a price set on their heads. "My lady," Barenziah jumped, startled at her servant's approach. "The Breton is here, King Edwire." The woman added hopefully, noting Barenziah's puzzlement. "Is there news, my lady?" she said, nodding at the nighthawk. "Nothing that will not wait," Barenziah said quickly. "See to the bird." King Edwire greeted her gravely and courteously, if rather fulsomely. He claimed to be her great admirer of Zemeckis, who figured prominently in his family's legends. Gradually he turned the conversation to her business with the Emperor. Finding her non-committal, he suddenly blurted out, "My lady queen, you must believe me. The man posing as the Emperor is an impostor. I know it sounds mad, but I—" "No," Barenziah said with a sudden decisiveness, "you are correct. I know." Edwire relaxed back into his seat for the first time, eyes shrewd. "You... no? You're not just humoring a madman, my lady. We need your aid." Barenziah smiled grimly at the irony. "Of what assistance might I be, my lord?" Quickly he outlined a plot. The imperial sorceress Rhea Silmain had been killed and declared a traitor by the false emperor, yet she retained a bit of her power and could yet contact a few of those she had known well enough on the mortal plane. She had chosen a champion who would undertake to assemble the missing staff pieces and use the staff's power to destroy Jagar Tharn, who was otherwise invulnerable, and rescue the true Emperor, who was being held prisoner in another plane. However, the chosen champion languished now in the Imperial dungeons. Tharn's attention must be diverted while he freed himself with Rhea's help. Barenziah had Tharn's ear and eye. Could she provide the necessary distraction? I suppose I could obtain another audience with him. Would that be sufficient? What do you mean, his eye? Edwire looked uncomfortable. It was whispered among the servants that Jagar Tharn kept her likeness in a sort of shrine in his chamber. That surprises you? Yes and no. Our chosen one may need a few days to escape. You trust me in this? Why? We are desperate, my lady. We have no choice, but yes, I do trust you. Zemeckis is dead, Barenziah explained quickly and coolly. My lady, what dreadful news. For the first time, Edwire's urbane poise was shaken. Under the circumstances, we can hardly ask. Nay, my lord king, under the circumstances I must do what I may to avenge myself upon the murderer of my children's father. In return, I ask only that you protect my orphan children as you may. Most willingly do I so pledge, most brave and noble lady. Old fool, Barenziah thought. She did not sleep that night, but sat in a chair beside her bed, hands folded in her lap, thinking long, deep thoughts. She would not tell the children, not yet, not until she must. She had no need to seek another audience with the Emperor, for a summons came in the morning. She told the children she expected to be gone a few days, bade them give the servants no trouble, kissed them goodbye. Morgaya whimpered a bit, for she was bored and lonely in the Imperial City. Halseth looked dour, but said nothing. He was like his father. At the palace, Barenziah was escorted not into the great hall, but a small parlor where the Emperor sat at a solitary breakfast. He nodded a greeting and waved his hand at the window. Splendid view, isn't it? Barenziah stared out over the towers of the great city. It dawned on her that this was the very chamber where she'd first met Tiber Septim. A strong wave of inchoate feeling swept over her. When she turned back, at last, Uriel Septim had vanished and Nightingale sat in his place, laughing. You knew, he said accusingly, scanning her face. I wanted to surprise you. You might at least pretend. Barenziah spread her arms. I'm afraid my skills at pretense are no match for yours, my liege. You're angry with me, he pretended to pout. Just a little, she said icily. I do find betrayal offensive. How human of you. What do you want of me? He wiped his mouth and stood erect. Now you are pretending. You know what I want of you, my love. You want to tantalize and torment me. Go ahead. I'm in your power. No. I don't want that at all, Barenziah. He came near, speaking low in the old caressing voice that sent shivers over her body. Don't you see? This was the only way. His hands closed on her arms. You could have taken me with you, tears gathered in her eyes. He shook his head. I didn't have the power. But now I have it all. Mine to have, mine to share, with you. He waved his hands toward the window and the city beyond, all Tamriel to lay at your feet. And that is only the beginning. It's too late. Too late. You left me to him. He's dead. A scant few years. What does it matter? The children. I'll adopt them. We'll have some others together, Barenziah. I have powers that you do not dream of. He moved to kiss her, but she slipped his grasp and turned away. I don't believe you. You do, you know. You're still angry, that's all. His smile did not reach his eyes. What do you want? She shrugged. A walk in the garden, a song or two. You want to be courted. Why not? You do it so well. It's been long enough. It's been long since I've had the pleasure. And so they spent their days in courtship, walking, talking, singing, and laughing together while the Empire's business was left to underlings. I'd like to see the staff, Barenziah said idly one day. I only had a glimpse of it. Nothing could give me greater pleasure, heart's delight, but that's impossible. You don't trust me? Barenziah pouted, but she softened her lips for his kiss. Nonsense, love. It isn't here. In fact, it isn't anywhere. He laughed and kissed her again softly. Now you're talking in riddles again. I want to see it. You can't have destroyed it. You gained in wisdom since we last met. You piqued my interest somewhat. The staff can't be destroyed, and it can't be removed from Tamriel, not without the direst consequences of the land itself. All true, and yet, as I said, it isn't anywhere. Can you solve the riddle? He pulled her to him, and she leaned into his embrace. Here's a greater riddle, he whispered. How to make one of two, that I can, and I will show you. Their bodies merged, limbs tangled together. Later, when they had drawn a bit apart and dozed, she thought sleepily, 1 of 2, 2 of 1, 3 of 2. what cannot be destroyed or banished, but might split apart, perhaps. Nightingale kept a diary. He scribbled entries in it each night after quick reports from his underlings. It was locked by the lock. It was a simple one. So Barenziah managed to sneak quick looks at it while he was occupied in toileting himself. She discovered that the first staff piece was hidden in an ancient dwarven mine called Fang Lair. Although its location was given only in vague terms, the diary was crammed with jotted events in an odd shorthand and was very hard to decipher. All Tamriel, she thought, in his hands and mine, and more, perhaps. Yet, for all his surface charm, there was a cool emptiness where his heart should have been, an emptiness of which he was quite unaware, she thought. One could glimpse in it now and then, when his eyes would go blank and hard. Peasant dreams, Barenziah thought, and straw flashed before her eyes, looking sad, and then Theris, with a mocking smile and empty eye sockets. Smekis, who did what must be done quietly and efficiently. Nightingale, who would rule all and more, and yet spread chaos in the name of control. Barenziah got reluctant leave from Nightingale to go to her children, who had to be told of their father's death and of the Emperor's offer of his protection to them. Edwire called on them while she was there, and she told him what she had discovered so far, and explained that she must remain a while yet and learn more as she could. Nightingale teased her about her elderly admirer. He was quite aware of Edwire's suspicions, although, he said, no one took the old fool seriously. Barenziah managed to arrange a reconciliation of sorts between them. Edwire publicly recanted his suspicions of his old friend, forgave him. Thus, he was invited to dine with them at least once a week. The children liked Edwire, even Halseth, who disapproved of his mother's liaison with the Emperor, and consequently detested Nightingale. He had become surly and temperamental, and frequently quarreled with both of them. Edwire was not happy either, and Nightingale delighted in publicly displaying his affection for Barenziah. They could not marry, of course, for Uriel Septim was already married. He had exiled the true Empress shortly after taking Septim's place, but had not dared to harm her. She was held by the Temple of the One. It had been given out publicly that she was in ill health, and rumors had been circulated that she had mental problems. The Emperor's children had also been dispatched to various prisons disguised as schools. "She'll grow worse in time," Nightingale said, carelessly, eyeing Barenziah's swollen breast and belly with satisfaction. "As for his children, well, life is dull, is full of hazards, isn't it? We'll be married. Your child will be my true heir." He did not want the child. Barenziah was sure of that. She was far less sure of his feelings for her. They quarreled often, violently usually, about Halseth, whom he wanted to send away to school. Barenziah made no effort to avoid these quarrels. Nightingale had no interest in a peaceful life, and he thoroughly enjoyed making up afterwards. Occasionally, Barenziah would take the children and retreat to their old apartment, declaring she wanted no more to do with him. She was 6 months pregnant before she finally deciphered the location of the last staff piece, an easy one, since every dark elf knew where Daggerfall was. When next she quarreled with the Nightingale, she simply left the city with Edwire, and they rode hard for High Rock and Wayrest. Nightingale was furious, but there was little he could do. His assassins were either inept, and he dared not leave his seat of power to pursue them in person, nor could he openly declare war on Wayrest, for he had no legitimate claim on her or her unborn child. The nobility had disapproved of his liaison with Barenziah, and were glad that she had gone. Wayrest was equally disapproving and distrustful of her, but Edwire was much beloved by his prosperous little city, and allowances were readily made for his eccentricities. Barenziah and Edwire were married a year after the birth of her son by Jagar Tharn. Edwire doted on her. She did not love him, but she was fond of him, and that was something. It was nice to have someone, and Wayrest was a very pleasant place, a good place for children to grow up, while they waited and hoped and prayed for their champion's success in his long mission. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the Real Barenziah Part 10. And as somebody who played Arena, this is really awesome kind of, retro, active lore that, we had gotten information that Rhea Silmain was the one helping us from the visions, but it was actually, through the use of Barenziah and Edwire, who was basically deciphering where these locations were. So that is really, really awesome. So again, a nice little bit of retroactive lore from the Real Barenziah series. So there is one more book, and I will be back with it in just a brief moment. Redguards, Their History and Their Heroes by Destry Millarg. Notes on the Redguards, Their History and Their Heroes. This is a publisher's proof of the initial draft of my book, Redguards, Their History and Their Heroes. The following is a collection of the tales, myths, and history of the Redguards. Much of their history is shrouded in mystery and in the mists of time. It is hard to distinguish between myths and real history. Below are the first chapters of the draft by Destry Millarg. Author's note is translated into the modern tongue of Hammerfall. Frandar Hunding was born in 2356 in the old way of reckoning in our beloved deserts of the old land. The traditional rule of emperors had been overthrown in 2012, and although each successive emperor remained the figurehead of the empire, his powers were very much reduced. Since that time, our people saw 300 years of almost continuous civil war between the provincial lords, warrior monks, and brigands, all fighting each other for land and power. Our people once were artisans, poets, and scholars, but the ever-evolving strife made the way of the sword inevitable. The song of the blade through the air, through flesh and bone, its ring against armor, an answer to our prayers. In the time of Lord Frandar, the first warrior prince, lords called Yokeda built huge stone castles to protect themselves and their lands, and castle towns outside the walls began to grow up. In 2245, however, Mansell Cisnet came to the fore. He became the Elden Yokeda, or military dictator, and for 8 years succeeded in gaining control of almost the whole empire. When Cisnet was assassinated in 2253, a commoner took over the government. Randik Torn continued the work of unifying the empire, which Cisnet had begun, ruthlessly putting down any traces of insurrection. He revived the old gulf between the warriors, the sword singers, and the commoners by introducing restrictions on the wearing of swords. Torn's sword hunt, as it was known, meant that only the singers were allowed to wear swords, which distinguished them from the rest of the population. Although Torn did much to settle the empire into its pre-strife ways, by the time of his death in 2373, internal disturbances had not been completely eliminated. Upon his death, civil war broke out in earnest, war that made the prior 300-year turmoil pale in comparison. It was in this period that Frandar Hunding grew up. Hunding belonged to the sword singers. This element of empire society grew from the desert artisans and was initially recruited from the young sons and daughters of the high families. They built the first temple to the unknown gods of war and built a training hall, the Hall of Virtues of War. Within a few generations, the way of the sword, the song of the blade, had become their life. The people of the blade kept their poetry and artisanship in building beautiful swords woven with magic and powers from the unknown gods. The greatest among them became known as Ansai, or Saints of the Sword. Each of these began their own training school, teaching their individual ways of the sword. Those Ansai of the highest virtue wandered the countryside, engaging in battle, righting wrongs, and seeking to end the strife. To sum it up, Hunding was a sword singer, a master Ansai, at a time when the peak of the strife was reborn out of the chaos of Torn's death. Many singers put up their swords and became artisans, for the pull of the artisan heritage was strong, but others, like Hunding, pursued the ideal of the warrior, searching for enlightenment through the perilous path of the sword. Duels of revenge and tests of skill were commonplace, and fencing schools were multiplied. Frandar du Hunding Hel Ansai no Shari, or as he commonly known, Frandar Hunding, was born in the far desert marches in the province of High Desert. Hunding is the name of the High Desert region near where he was born. No Shira means noble person or person of noble birth, and Hel Ansai is his title of sword sainthood. Hunding's ancestors reached back to the beginning of recorded time in the High Desert and were artisans and mystics. His grandfather was a retainer of the Elden Yokenda Mansell Cisnet, and many of the battles of unification prior to Cisnet's assassination. When he was 14, Hunding's father died in one of the many insurrections, and he was left to support his mother and 4 brothers. His prowess with the sword, however, made his life both difficult and easy. Easy in that his services came in great demand, and as a guardian and escort. Hard in that his reputation preceded him, and many awaited their turn to face him in battle and gain instant fame through his defeat. By the time Hunding was 30, he had fought and won more than 90 duels, killing all of his opponents, and becoming virtually invincible with the sword, gaining such skill and mastery that he finally stopped using the real sword created through the artisanship of his people and began using the Shahai, or Way of the Spirit sword. All sword singers learned through their intense training and devotion to the gods of war and the Way of the Sword, the forms of the discipline that allow the creation of the Spirit sword. This is simply a form of magic or mind mastery whereby an image of a sword is formed from pure thought. The sword singer forms the sword by concentrating, and it takes shape in his hand, usually a pale thing of light, misty and insubstantial, a thing of beauty perhaps, a symbol of devotion to the way and the gods, but no weapon. However, those onsai of the highest level and sensitivity, and those with talent in magic, can at times of stress form a spirit sword, the Shahai, which is far more than light and air. It is an unstoppable weapon of great might, a weapon which can never be taken from the owner without also taking his mind. The Shahai became Hunding's weapon, and with this he slew bands of brigands and wandering monsters that infested the land. Finally, upon finishing his 90th duel, defeating the evil Lord Janek and his 7 lich followers, he was satisfied that he was indeed invincible. Hunding then turned to formulating his philosophy of the way of the sword. He wrote his learnings down in the Book of Circles, while living as a hermit in a cave in the mountains of High Desert in his 60th year. In that year, Hunding, having enlisted in many battles of the Empire, defeating all opponents, had thought himself ready for death, and retired to a cave to capture his strategy and mystical visions to share with other sword singers. It was after his completion of the Scroll of the Circle that the singers found him composing his death poem and preparing to join the gods of war in final rest. At 60 years, he was a vigorous man who thought himself through with life, but his people, the sword singers, needed him. They needed him as never before. Torn's sword hunt had separated the singers from the common people, and the rise of the last emperor began the last great strife of the Desert Empire. The Empire and his constant final effort to wrest control of the Empire from the people by destroying the sword singers, Hera vowed to search out every singer with his brigand army composed of orcs and cast-offs of the wars of the empires, and to scourge them from the face of the planet. The sword singers were never a numerous people. The harsh desert kept the births few, and growing up in the unforgiving wastes eliminated all but those of iron spirit and will. Thus, the final strife, which became known as the War of the Singers, found the people of the sword unprepared and unready to join together their individually great skills into an army that could defend their homes and lives. Frandar Hunding was sought out, his death poem interrupted, and unceremoniously command of the efforts was thrust upon him. To the unknown gods of war, great thanks is owed that Hunding had the time in his cave to write down his years of accumulated wisdom of strategy of the way of the Shahai. The singers fled for their camps up in the desert hills and mountains, fled to the foot of Hatu, the father of mountain, where Hunding had gone to write in peace and to die, and there these remnants formed in the army of the Circle. They learned Hunding's way, his strategies, his tactics, and the final great vision for a master stroke. Hunding devised a plan of 7 battles, leading the armies of Hera further and further into the wilderness, to the foot of Hatu, where the final battle could be fought. Hunding called his plan the Hammer and the Anvil. With each battle, Hunding's singers would further learn his strategies and tactics, grow strong in the use of the Shahai, and be ready to defeat their opponents in the 7th battle. And thus it was. The 6 first battles were waged, each neither victory or defeat, each leading to the next. The larger army of Hera following the smaller army of Hunding, outnumbered 30 to 1, the singers never faltered from the way. The stage was set. Hera and his army maneuvered to the base of Hatu Mountain, where the hammer blow was delivered. The battle was pitched, and many singers fell that day. Hunding knew that his singers who lived would be few, but Hera and his empire of evil would not live, and so it went. At the end, Hunding and less than 20,000 singers survived that day. But no army of evil was left to pillage and murder. More than 300,000 fell that day on Hatu. Of those who were left to run and live, all were scattered to the 4 winds, an organized force no more. The singers packed their lives, folded their tents, and mourned their dead, and followed Hunding to the great port city of Arch, in the province of Seawind. There, Hunding had a flotilla of ships waiting. The singers left their desert for a new land. No longer welcome the Desert Empire, they left this to be sung and spoken of in legend. The final great warrior, the singers of Shahai, the Book of Circles, all leaving that land where their virtue was unappreciated. Red with blood, they were in the eyes of the gentle citizenry, never mind that they had saved them from a great evil. The singers vowed to learn new ways as they traveled across the great ocean to their new land, to adopt a new name, but to honor the past. In honor of their final battle, they named the new land Hammerfell, and adopted the name Redguards. In honor to Hunding, the new great warrior prince, each household in Hammerfell has a place by the hearth and an alcove really, just a niche big enough to hold the scroll, the Book of Circles. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was Redguards, their history and their heroes, and that is also the end of today's bonus episode, so thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.